Hello everyone, welcome to the lecture series of Heritage Safeguard Mentality. And today we are going to present a lecture on famine in 1943. And here is with us the Professor Mohammad Mozahidul, and he is the Professor of History Department, Jahangirnagar University, and he is also the adjunct faculty of North-South University. He published so many books and articles on contemporary politics, Islam, and he is a specialist on politics of food security and also famine. So today he is going to talk on famine in 1943, and he also going to relate with the present Bangladesh, how it's acted in present Bangladesh and what is the impact on that. So we are going to hear from him, and he is going to give us a lecture on famine in 1943. So please, I would like to welcome Professor Mozahidul. Please.
Thank you very much, Professor Masudimran Manu, and I would like to thank Heritage Safeguard Mentality for inviting me to provide this lecture. Well, to begin with this lecture, first of all, I would like to tell you that the British rule started with the famine in Bengal and ended with the famine in Bengal as well. So why I said so? The reason why I'm saying that is mainly because that in 1770 there was a famine in Bengal, and in 1943 there was another famine in Bengal. So it means, like, in fact, although we know that the Bengal British role or British influence started here in Bengal after the Battle of Palashi, the fact that actually they took control over the economy of Bengal after the dual system that took place in 1765. So after the dual system, introduction of the dual system, only 4 years after that incident in 1769 and 1779, a famine occurred in Bengal, and also only 4 years before of leaving or transfer the power of India, there is also outbreak of famine in Bengal. So both of them were very serious. Now famine, in fact, what we suggest, or those who are expert on famines in India, they always argue that famine was never unknown in India, but that famine increasingly became lethal during the British colonial rule because of two particular reasons. One reason, what we call the export of food grains, and another one is what we call the introduction of the cash crops, wide-scale cash crops. So the replacement of food crops with the indigo and jute and other cash crops. That was also one of the major reasons for these many famines that occurred in Bengal during the time of the British colonial rule. But some of these famines were beyond control, and some of these famines somehow the British authority managed to some scale or major scale. For example, as we said, that the first famine during the British colonial rule, that was the Bengal famine of 1769 and 1770. As a background, I need to say a few words about it, and that thing is that it was such a huge famine that according to some estimate that 1/3 of the population of Bengal died mainly because of this famine. Another estimate that suggests that almost half of the people perished in Bengal mainly because of this famine. And then we would say that in 1873-74, also there was an famine which somehow the British authority managed by proactive public policy. And then there was a famine also in 1879 and 97, when the strict operation of famine courts didn't prevent significant excess of mortality. And then finally, in 1943 and 1944, a famine occurred in Bengal. That is our subject matter of today's discussion. And in this famine, according to some estimate, that 3.8 million people are Bengali people, or in other words, that 38 lakhs Bengali perished this famine. So that was a huge scale of famine. In fact, there is no doubt about that. Now, in my lecture today, I have several discussion points. The first point is about the 1942. Actually, I'm going to introduce in the context of Bengal, the year of 1942, what happened. This is what we call the background of the famine. So actually, the famine occurred in 1943, but what happened in Bengal in 1942, we need to understand that as a background, otherwise we will not understand the famine. And then the next issue I'm going to highlight, that is about what happened in Bengal during the famine. So the consequence or the impact of famine, in other words. And then we will talk about the price hike of staple food rice in Bengal, the trend. Then we talk about the government initiatives, and then we will go for the most important discussion point, that what we call the causes of the famine. So in this discussion, actually, I was used three sets of broad arguments. So one is that about called the food availability decline, and the another one is called the entitlement approach. It's not because of the food availability decline. The third approach, what we call the imperial causes. That means the argument is that the British Empire is responsible for making this famine. So these are the three broad sets of argument. There are different literature, thousands of literatures, those which are focused on the famine of Bengal, but all these literatures can be put into three different baskets, and that is why I call it that three sets of argument to understand the causes of the famine of Bengal. And then we will shed little light about the domestic politics of and the famine, and how was the famine reduced, or then finally we would conclude the lecture. So these are the subject matter of my discussion today. Now, when we're talking about the Bengal famine of 1943, first of all, we need to say a few words about what do we mean by Bengal during this time. So Bengal, as we know that in 1943, the whole Indian subcontinent, it was the British Indian Empire. So as a part of the British Indian Empire, this Bengal was then undivided Bengal. Undivided Bengal, that means in other words, the East Bengal or today's Bangladesh and the West Bengal province of today's India. So together, these two parts together were known as the undivided Bengal, with some other parts of territory of India. And Kolkata was the capital. They used to call it Calcutta. So then what we call Kolkata. So Kolkata was basically then the capital of the undivided Bengal. So then famine occurred in the entire Bengal. So, and it was basically under the control of the British Indian Empire. So we had local government in Kolkata, but this government was also under the control of the British government. So that is the point what we need to keep it in our mind before going to understand this topic. Now, what was the situation of the 1942 in Bengal? So, or in other words, what was the background of the famine? Now, the Second World War basically made the things worse. As we know that the Second World War started in 1939 and continued until 1943. So in that Second World War, Japan, along with Germany and Italy, so basically played a very vital role in the Second World War. On the contrary, British India was supporting the British government, so British and other European powers. So alliance and axis power, what we call in other words. Now, during this time, actually what happened is that the Japanese forces occupied Burma in 1942. So this incident of this occupation of Burma in 1942 had a great impact on this economic, social, and other context of Bengal. So that's what we need to understand. Without this Japanese occupation in Burma, perhaps there could have the possibility to avoid the famine, but it played a very major role. There is no doubt about that. And because of this, particularly as Japanese forces occupied Burma in 1942, that is going to significant impact, particularly on the export of rice or import of rice in our context, basically, because this occupation cutting off Indian rice imports from Burma. We need to tell you here is that in 1942 and before that, Bengal and other parts of India were heavily dependent for importing rice from the then Burma, today what we call the Myanmar. And also Indian civilian exodus from Burma into Manipur, Bengal, and Assam between January and July took place in 1942. That means, in other words, there is a large number of Bengali people and others who were coming from Burma to Bengal, Manipur, and other parts. So it increased the total number of the population suddenly. And then the third impact of this was that because of this Japanese occupation in Burma, Kolkata became a hub for hundreds of thousands of the Allied troops. So we would see that the American troops, British troops, and other European troops, they were all in Kolkata. And during the time of this famine crisis, we would see that the government was basically providing food to those troops rather than the local people. So it had also significant impact. Then there was, of course, a destructive cyclone that took place between the 16 and 17 October 1942, which hit the Bengal coast, and just when the crucial winter crop was maturing and surviving rice was damaged by the disease. So, and then officials of British Raj offering a Japanese invasion, fearing of a Japanese invasion, they confiscated everything that might help the invade force, for example, boats, carts, motor vehicles, elephants, and crucially, all the rice available. So the reason why they were doing that is mainly because they thought that if we have the available transport authority, that will create some problem for the local security. And then that is why they confiscated everything. Now, the Japanese never came, but but panicking public and many crafty businessmen immediately began to hoard rice, and the staple food of the people quickly disappeared from the marketplace, and that caused a famine. So that's what we could call like an immediate impact of the famine. Now the question is, what happened in Bengal during the famine? So actually what happened? Hundreds of thousands perished in the villages of Bengal, and by the middle of 1943, we would see that hordes of starving people are flooding into Calcutta, and most dying on the streets, often in front of well-stocked shops or restaurants serving lavish meals. So according to a journalist, in Kolkata and many other places, there was a distinctive Soros order, which the victims gave off a few hours before the end. And the most important thing that happens during the famine is not only about the Bengal famine, but in most of the famines in history, if we analyze the famine, there are four things basically occurred. The number one is, of course, the death toll. So the number two, what we call the assets exchanges or assets transfer, and the number three, and other reasons I'm coming back. So the most important thing is, of course, the death toll that took place during this famine. But before that, let me explain a little bit about the assets exchanges. During the famine, the famine led to a marked decline in the economic positions and social status of about 7 lakh families or 38 lakh persons in the province through the sale of their tangible assets such as the land, plow, cattle, jewelry, utensils, tools, and implements, and 3.5 lakh families were reduced to destitutions. So this is one number. If we go through like some evidences, what we find, one researcher, particularly here, we focus that the year before the famine and the year of the famine, there is a huge differences of the record that is related to the land sales, and so particularly in the registration office of land. So there is a huge difference, means that the year of the famine, most of the people, they were going to sell their lands to survive. So they were selling their every stuff, what they used to belong. So that is why what we call the most important and devastating impact of the famine that took place in Bengal in 1943. And then there is a death toll. Death toll, according to some calculation, that during this famine, between the period of 1943 to 1946, over 3.5 to 3.8 million people died as a result of famine and also related epidemic diseases that accompanied it. So these were deaths in excess of mortal, normal mortality. That means, in other words, that there was a trend of the death, but it was in against that. This is the additional number, what I would like to say. And indeed, this was the worst of the famines that had struck any parts of subcontinent after 1770. So following the Famine Inquiry Commission, the causes and the chain of the events that led to the famine may be discussed from the fall of Burma early in 1943, agricultural prices, which is the price of the food crops, and which had been rising since the outbreak of the World War II and now increased further during the time of the famine. So there is several graphs I'd like to show you about the wholesale trend of the wholesale price of coarse rice between the period of 1943 and 1942 and 1943. So what we would see that in 1942, after the fall of Singapore, gradually there was an upward trend of the skyrocketing price of the coarse rice in Kolkata in general and Bengal in general, Kolkata in particular. So now, what could be the reason for the price hike or the skyrocketing price of the rice? So that is also important point we need to discuss. So there are several reasons for which that the price increased dramatically during the time of the famine, particularly from the late 1942 and throughout the 1943. So firstly, there was widespread fear of an imminent Japanese invasion of the province and a general feeling of uncertainty prevailing in large areas. So consequently, the cultivators were cautious in selling their produce. That means most of the peasants, they realized that a war is imminent and therefore there will be a crisis of rice, and that is why they were hoarding their own rice. They were not selling in the market. At the same time, the pressure of the demand of the market supply increased as the consumers, anxious to ensure supplies, were making large purchases. And it is also accompanied with the British government, that the British government actually were also encouraging the people in initial stages to hoard for 2 months food. That created some artificial crisis. And secondly, the import of rice from Burma, as I already mentioned, was now stopped. At the same time, the export of rice to other Indian provinces, which depended on Burmese imports, increased overnight. Thirdly, the danger of Japanese invasion compelled the military authorities to put into operation early in 1942 a denial policy which involved two measures. So the government stocks were released, but only to feed the people of Kolkata, especially British businessmen and their employees, railway, port workers, and government staffs. Control shops were open for less important Kolkatas, and the urban population never suffered too greatly. So in view of the rise in price level of the government decided to intervene in the market in June, issued an order fixing the statutory maximum price of the coarse rice and medium rice in Kolkata markets. But what was then the government initiatives? Well, in a nutshell, if I try to explain the government initiatives to the ordinary people of Kolkata or in Bengal, then I must say that the rural masses or the ordinary people, they were left to the wolves. That means nothing was done for them. This was when Churchill, the then British Prime Minister, could have made a difference by sending wheat or rice to Bengal. Even some British officials, they also argued that it could have a serious impact if Churchill could intervene, if he could send some rice to the people of the Bengal. But ultimately, that never took place. Immediately, supplies disappeared from Kolkata and several districts. At this point, the stocks of the denial rice proved most useful. Very soon, the ineffective of the statutory rice limit became clear, and district officers were therefore instructed not to try to enforce the price limits, except the cases of the gross profiteering. These decisions, together with the embargo on export to the other Indian provinces, somewhat eased the situation supplied, and rice appeared to have again reached something like a state of equilibrium. But the situation deteriorated very soon. In October, a cyclone of a great intensity struck the coastal districts, comprising an area of 3,200 square miles, causing considerable damage of standing almond crops. After cyclone came, crops disease, and consequently, the almond crops harvested towards the end of 1942 was very short. So this is for basically, ultimately, the famine occurred. Now the point is, what are the causes of the famine? As I said at the onset of this lecture, that in general, there are three broad sets of argument about the causes of the famine. First, what we call the argument by the Amartya Sen, and he suggested that food rice more precisely was available in the market, but this could not be accessible or accessed by the poor because of lack of entitlement to the market. So this, in other words, what we would say that argument by Amartya Sen, he explained that one of the major reasons because of the that caused the famine is basically failure of the entitlement. And the second argument is about what we call that there was a real lack of food. That means, in other words, this is explained by using a terminology, what we call the food availability decline. So there was a real lack of food, mainly due to the natural disaster, lack of production, or failure of importation. And the third one is what we call that third argument about the causes of the famine looks at the larger realm of the empire, pointing figure to self-seeking imperial policies. That means Churchill and his cabinet were responsible for making up a famine in Bengal. So these are basically the three reasons that what I'm going to highlight here in my lecture today to explain the causes of the famine in Bengal. Now, if I begin with this food availability decline, so this is basically the argument, the origin of this argument is from the Food Inquiry Commission. So that commission was formed soon after the famine by the British government. And the commission provided a report, what we call the Food Inquiry Commission's report. And most of the literature, most of the historians for a while, quite a long period of time, they use this material as the foundation or to the major reason to understand the famine of Bengal. Now, according to this Famine Inquiry Commission, the famine was caused by two factors. Firstly, during 1943, there was a serious shortage in the total supply of rice available for consumption in Bengal as compared to the supply normally available. So this, what, in other words, as I said, that food availability decline. That means that because of this some natural disaster, because of the outbreak of the Second World War, because of some other reason, so there was a food availability decline in Bengal. So that is the major argument of this. And the second argument was that thus total supply of rice in 1943 would have made 49 weeks requirements of the province, leaving a deficit of about 5%. That means, in other words, there was a total deficit of 5% of the rice required for the province of Bengal. Secondly, there was a phenomenal increase of price level. Consequently, food grains prices went beyond the purchasing power of those who normally depended on the market supply for the part of the whole year, and there was large-scale starvation and death. So that means because of the price hike, ultimately a large number of people, they failed to purchase the food grain from the market, and that caused to the famine. So this is basically the argument of the food availability decline, or the argument of the what we said that food inquiry commissions. And most of the historians in early stage, they worked following these guidelines. And then there was a major breakthrough on this understanding of the Bengal famine in 1981 when Amartya Sen came up with a new work, and he suggested that actually the famine occurred not because of the food availability decline, but rather mainly because of the entitlement failure of the people of Bengal. So Amartya Sen rejects what he calls the standard explanation of famine. So what do we mean by standard explanation of famine? As I said, standard explanation of famine means that famine occurred mainly because of the lack of food in the market. But these view that the crisis was caused by the food availability decline. On the contrary, he argued that in 1943 was not a very good year in terms of this food availability in the market, but it was not by any means a disastrous year either. So what does it mean? So he compared basically the food availability in Bengal over the 4 or 5 years, compared between the 1941, 42, 43, 44, and 45, using the statistical data provided by the Famine Inquiry Commission. And he has shown that actually we would see that in the year of 1941, there was a more food availability decline rather than the year of 1943. Amartya Sen's view that food availability did not cause the famine is based on two evidences. For example, as I already said, that he said the supply of food grains in 1943 was not too bad, not very bad, and 1941 was much worse in terms of the food availability, but there was no famine in that year. Famine occurred in 1943, according to him, because of a large section of the population. There was a marked decline in exchange and entitlement to rice. So here, perhaps, in a very nutshell, I need to explain what do we mean by exchange entitlement. So Amartya Sen basically offers 3 or 4 bundles of the entitlement, and he said that people could get some food using different entitlements. For example, a peasant is producing their own rice, our own staple food, and therefore this is their entitlement, that he has his land, he has his labor using which he is producing his own rice. On the contrary, for example, as a service holder myself, I'm not producing my food, but I'm earning money by providing my service, and therefore I'm using this money to buy this food from the market. This is what he says that is an exchange entitlement. Now, there are different types of people, those who make a huge amount of money, and there are many day laborers, those who cannot make huge amount of money. So during this time of the Second World War and in 1942, because of many other crises, many of people are unemployed. For example, because of the denial policy of the British government in 1943, as the British government, they confiscated boats, for example, then many fishermen, they had no job to do, and therefore, because they were not using their boat, therefore they were unable to go for the fishing, and as they were unable to go for the fishing, they were not making money, and as they were not making money, so they were unable to buy food for themselves. So that created a challenge, or what we call the decline in exchange entitlement. Now, Amartya Sen puts it that, or in other words, in the Amartya Sen said that the food availability decline approach gives little clue to causal mechanism of starvation, since it does not go into the relationship of people to food. So what is the relationship between the people and food? Food availability approach actually does not help to understand that. Whatever may be the oracular power of the food availability view, it is certainly Delphic in the Radicin. On the contrary, so if I go for the third approach, that is more interesting, I find, and this approach actually drawn or worked by one Indian European author known as the Madhusri Mukherjee. So she published a very famous book called Churchill's Secret War, and that book was published in the year of 2011 perhaps, and she provided an excellent interpretation in that famine. And in Churchill's Secret War, however, Madhusri Mukherjee says the disasters in its imperial context, showing how the story of famine was interwoven with the history of Gandhi's Quit India movement and the attitudes and priorities of the Prime Minister Churchill and his war cabinet. It establishes how Churchill and his associates could easily have stopped the famine with a few shipments of the food grains, but refused, in spite of repeated appeal from the successor viceroys, Churchill own Secretary of State for India, and even the President of the United States. This means, in other words, many other officials, by the American President to successive viceroys and Churchill's own Secretary of State, they all are arguing to provide some food in India, particularly in Bengal, but Churchill declined to do so. And in order to support her argument, Madhusri Mukherjee puts examples such as Australia and Canada were eager to send wheat, but virtually all merchant ships plying in the Indian Oceans area had been moved to Atlantic in order to bring food to Britain, which already had a comfortable stockpiles. So in other words, Churchill were not interested to provide any foods. Even Canada, Australia wanted to provide. They sent their ships with the wheat load of sheep, they sailed in the Indian Oceans, but that was taken away to the Europe in order to provide more stockpiles for ensuring the food availability during the Second World War time in Europe at the cost of the people or sufferings of the people of Bengal. When informed that some of the Indian Council members might resign, this is very interesting that Churchill, referring to the Indians, he said that what did it matter if a few black Moors resigned? We could show that the world that we were governing. So black Moor is basically a racial epithet for the people who are black or dark skinned. On the consequence, if Gandhi died, Churchill said, we should get rid of a bad man and an enemy of the empire. This was not the time to crawl before the miserable old man who had always been our enemy. So actually in other statement he says, so if Gandhi died, why hasn't Gandhi yet died? That was also the argument of the Churchill. So his argument was that actually this would happen nothing. So this is how that this author, particularly as I said, that Madhusri Mukherjee, she emphasized on this imperial reason, that empire itself, the British Indian Empire itself, was basically responsible for making of these famine, which could be easily avoided by taking some small initiative by the British government. And that initiative is even proposed by the Viceroys of India, that was proposed by the other global governments, but Churchill completely ignored. And in that book, Churchill's Secret War, in that book, Madhusri Mukherjee clearly explained a huge number of evidences from the archives, particularly the discussion between Churchill and his war cabinets, and the discussion and the official writing documents of the various officials of the cabinet, war cabinet of the Britain. And so this is how she has shown that this famine was basically manufactured intentionally by the British Indian Empire for their own interest. Not basically, it is never happened because of the food availability decline, or this argument actually even challenged the argument of the Amartya Sen. Interesting to note that after writing this book, I was going through one newspaper, an American newspaper, where she wrote an article, and after that, in the comment section, there was a ongoing debate between Amartya Sen and Madhusri Mukherjee, both of them claiming their position, and that was an excellent and fascinating discussion. So many authors, for example, in the year of the perhaps 2016 or 17, Shashi Tharoor, he published, one very famous Indian author, he published another very important book. The title of the book is called the Unglorious, so an era of darkness. So that an era of darkness. So in that darkness book, he also suggested a similar type of argument, and he said that basically the famine was the outcome of the British policy. And because he is a very popular speaker, and therefore many people often do understand, this is perhaps the first argument made by the Shashi Tharoor. In fact, this is not the case. The argument was made by the Churchill. And after even that, we would see that recently, I guess in last year, there was one interesting research outcome was published. And that published research, for the first time, they argued that this famine of Bengal was the only famine that does not appear to be linked directly to the soil moisture, drought and crop failures. That means most of the famines occurred any parts of the world. If you go for the soil testing, then you would find that there was a trend of the soil that suggests that there is a drought. And without drought, there is a very small number of famine occurred any parts of the world. But these Bengal famines, the scientists discovered that there is no link between this soil moisture that suggests that there is a drought in Bengal. That means, in other words, these new findings of the famine, they suggest that natural causes is no way linked with the famine. And these arguments are also further they argues, and in last year perhaps, they further boast of their argument by arguing that the royal or the British Empire is largely responsible for making this famine. Particularly, Churchill and his war cabinet was responsible for this famine. Now, and then finally, in the year of the 1943, we will see that the harvest of the almond crop is coming back, and with the arrival of these supplies from these other parts of India, there was a considerable decline in the rice price, and interestingly, of the famine was reduced. But the death rate remaining high throughout 1944. This was due to the triple outbreak of the epidemic of cholera, smallpox, and malaria. Hunger, economic distress, and disease continued throughout 45 and 1946, but at a much reduced rate. So one particular point I need to mention here, that is about this outbreak of the epidemic of cholera, smallpox, and malaria, particularly the outbreak of epidemic of cholera and smallpox. So these two are basically very much linked with the starvation and famine, because when people go hungry, they basically eat everything which is not eatable, as they are eating everything, including the human the human flesh of the dead. So when they are eating this sort of thing, and that ultimately caused to the various outbreak of the various type of the diseases, which includes cholera and chickenpox. And so the death toll always during a famine is not only linked to the starvation and hunger, it is also accompanied with the other diseases, which could never happen without the starvation. So that is what we would suggest. To conclude, I would like to cite one author known as the Ashok Mitra, and he said that colonial policies in Bengal were at the root of the disastrous famine of 1943. The denial and evacuation of policies implemented the year before with such ruthlessness only resulted in creating an artificial scarcity situation in some areas and sent the prices shooting up. The cyclone of 1942 made the matter worse. Moreover, the British administrators suppressed all news of this situation for a long time. So ultimately, these are several reasons for which the famine occurred. But above all, I agree with Madhusri Mukherjee, and I would suggest that the policy of the Churchill and his war cabinet are seriously responsible for making this famine. And in fact, I would finally endorse the argument of Madhusri Mukherjee, where she compared Hitler and Churchill. There is no way to believe that Churchill is better than Hitler. To win in a war, he basically killed over 3.8 million people in Bengal by creating this famine. Thank you very much. And before ending my lecture, one particular interpretation I need to provide, or I need to make it clear, and that is about the I several times say it in this discussion, Burma. Perhaps the young people of the young generation or the young generations might misunderstand me. What do we mean by Burma? Today, as we know, that this is called Myanmar. So previously, during this time of the 1943, 44, 45, or 40s, 50s, this country, Myanmar, what we know today, Myanmar, was basically known as the Burma. And all the literature of the Second World War and all the literature of India in 1940s could be found the country as Burma, not as Myanmar. And that is why I interchangeably use both this terminology, Myanmar as well as Burma. By saying here Myanmar, I'm referring to Burma. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mohammad Mozahid. You brilliantly mapped the total Bengal famine in 1943, especially its political economy. And we came to know that this political economy in detail, that how it was. And at the end, we found that Churchill and Hitler, there is no differences, but always history goes with the winner. So Churchill never ever been shamed like Hitler, but we got Churchill in the case of famine. Churchill is that time is the Hitler in this respect. But in this format of lecture session, we have no room to directly take any question. So in that regards, I would like to everyone who are listening us, please put your question below the video. Then me and also Professor Mojahid can answer those questions. If you have any questions, please put your question below the this video, and we can easily answer your questions. So thank you everyone. Thank you Professor Mojahid for giving us your precious time, and thank you everyone to listening to us. Thanks everyone. Please keep going with us. Heritage Safeguard Mentality.